Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Intelligence Square debate, Dickens versus Tolstoy, the battle of the great 19th century novelists. And I have to say, it's quite an honor to be on this stage with two distinguished academics and experts and this wonderful company, so I'm very grateful to be here. The way we're going to do it is like this. In one corner, we have Charles Dickens, Great Expectations, of course, Bleak House, you know the drill. And in the other, we have Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, you know that drill. And if, in fact, if you could even try and imagine 19th century literature, world literature, without these titans, try, you can't. Now, you have been polled as you enter the hall, and you'll have the chance to vote again at the end of the evening when you've heard the arguments and seen the performances by this great company. So you should all have a voting slip with Dickens and Tolstoy printed on it. Tear the slip in two and put one or other name in the ballot box when the time happens. And if you're still undecided, put the whole thing in the box, okay? All right, everybody chilled, ready? Here we go. For Charles Dickens, stage right, John Mullan, Lord Northcliffe Professor of Modern English Literature, University College London. John has written, among many things, an acclaimed book on Jane Austen, and next year he will be publishing Dickens' Tricks, a book about the techniques Dickens uses in his fiction. And stage left, for Leo Tolstoy, we have Simon Schama. Simon is University Professor of Art History and History at Columbia University in New York. He's one of Britain's most popular and admired historians and television broadcasters, and he invented a genre as far as I'm concerned. His latest book is Belonging, the second volume of his history of the Jewish people. And can we have a hand for John and Simon? Now, I don't like the word illustrate because actors don't illustrate. They will be the characters in this work, and they will bring it to life for you. And first of all, can we have a hand for the company in general? Zawe Ashton is stage right. She starred in the television shows Wanderlust and Fresh Meat. Her screen credits include Greta, Misfits, Sherlock, and Gorilla. Zawe Ashton. Next to her is the very distinguished actor, and I'm trembling to even say the words, Timothy West, who has played as we say in Chicago, gracing this stage. He has played Macbeth, King Lear, Uncle Vanya on stage, and his film credits include The Day of the Jackal, The 39 Steps, and Oliver Twist. Mr. Timothy West. Next to Mr. West is Julia Sawalha, who gave me a beautiful lesson on her name, and I will never forget that. She is known for her iconic performance in BBC's Absolutely Fabulous. And also, because that is, she is also the star of Cranford and Lark Rise to Candleford, as well as numerous stage and film roles. Julia Sawalha. Next to Julia is Mr. Tom Hiddleston, star of stage and screen, and whose leading roles include the BBC's The Hollow Crown and The Night Manager, for which he recently won a Golden Globe. Tom. And last but definitely not least, Kit Kingsley on our far right, stage right. Now, wait a minute. This is the deep thing. You never say things like a star is born on stage because that's bad luck. All I'm gonna say is, this is a great one, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is his professional debut. Now, we are going to stay strictly to time, and that's why they asked me, I think, to be the timekeeper. I'm going to ask each of our advocates, I'm going to start with Simon. 1 minute, your passion, how did you find Tolstoy?
Well, I had a really good friend who died much too young, who was a friend of mine at college, and he simply could not believe that anyone had the temerity to call themselves an historian without actually having read War and Peace. So I did immediately, while I was actually having a job I was the only straight man in the soft furnishings department at Liberty's.
So that's what led you to it, yes.
Yeah, so I used to go around the corner to a veggie restaurant and get my dose of Tolstoy as Tolstoy would have wanted, and never look back.
Very good, thank you. And John, Dickens.
Well, I think it's all down to somebody called Mr. Reggiani, who I fear isn't with us anymore. But if he is out there, I owe it all to you, Mr. Reggiani, who was a rather sardonic, occasionally slightly sneery English teacher who did a wonderful thing which was once a week. I think it was on Friday, and I think it was when he was tired and bored. He would read aloud to us every Friday, and that's what he did in English. And I remember that 2 books he read aloud were Alistair MacLean's Force 10 from Navarone, which actually was quite good, and David Copperfield. I realise now he must have much abridged it, but it was just hearing him read it out. And we're going to have a bit of David Copperfield later, but I'll still hear Mr. Reggiani's voice as a kind of descant, I think.
So for both of you, these were pivotal moments, a moment that this work spoke to you at some point and you became sort of attached to it.
Yeah, I would just say to scramble things up a bit, my father used to read Dickens every Sunday after tea. Yeah, actually my dad finally saved up enough money to have his first summer holiday, and on the way to Victoria Station, actually ran into a barrow boy with a complete set of Dickens, and he exchanged his holiday money for that set of Dickens, which I now have. So this is an evening of tempestuous conflict for me.
And divided love.
Yeah.
Divided love. We start now with John Mullan and Dickens.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to play an honourable part here, and I determined before I arrived here that I wasn't going to be oppositional. Mm-hmm. Oh, you want me to stand?
Yeah, talk.
Stand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you're
No, that's good. That's good. I feel like Mr. Crummles. That's an illusion. I thought I'm not going to be oppositional and compare and contrast and slag off or anything like that, but I will, after all, I thought, I love Tolstoy. I quite like Simon. But I thought I would just say one little thing about Tolstoy and Dickens right at the beginning, and that is just anecdotal, really, which is a couple of years ago, I visited Tolstoy's country house. He has Naya Polyana, about 150 miles south of Moscow, and it was a British council Beano, and so we were getting the full tour, and from a Tolstoy expert, and I was shown into the room where Tolstoy died, where also his last place of study and writing was, and he shifted his study around the house at different times. And she told us the one thing that remained constant wherever he was working and writing in his years in the house was the picture above his desk. And you know what I'm going to say, don't you? The picture above his desk was a portrait. Still there, the very one. And it's a portrait of Charles Dickens. We could stop there, could we, maybe? It's a portrait of Charles Dickens. And he had it there. Every time he looked up thinking, what's Kitty going to say next? There was Charles Dickens. And that's because I think Dickens did what I would argue he does to many, many writers, but actually to all his readers. And weirdly, even to some people who sort of haven't actually read a whole novel, but have heard the words, phrases, even bits of dialogue on TV or cinema. He feeds our imaginations like no other writer. I meant to say, as a claim for his special prowess, the most important thing about Dickens and the way he feeds our imaginations is he's funny. He's funny. But that's not right, is it? That's not quite right. I think it's better to say, I decided that I changed from the Victoria line to the Jubilee line and thought saying he's funny is not good enough. That's not right. He's funny when he shouldn't be. That's what's great about Dickens. He's funny at the wrong times in the unexpected places where everybody's at a funeral or a deathbed. He's funny. And he himself had a description of what he was doing when he was funny at the wrong places at the wrong times. And it's in Oliver Twist, and he says, he's comparing his writing, very characteristic of Dickens, he's comparing his writing to the stage melodrama, much despised by critics, much loved by audiences of his day. And he's talking about the way in a stage melodrama of his day, just after a scene where somebody's languishing in a dungeon, somebody will come on and sing a comic song. And he says that his writing, like such melodrama, is, he says, like a side of streaky bacon. The tragic and the comic, you see, absurdly alternate. But, as he says, that's what it's like, isn't it? That's what life is like, the absurd and the comic alternating alongside each other when they shouldn't be. And I hope you'll hear that in our first reading, which has got quite a bit of streaky baconness in it, I think. It doesn't need much introduction because it's the opening of a novel. It's the opening, the very opening of Great Expectations.
Ours was the marsh country, down by the river. Within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable, raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried. And that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried. And that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes. And that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip.
Hold your noise!
Cried a terrible voice as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch.
Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat.
A fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg. A man with no hat and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied round his head. A man who'd been soaked in water and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin.
Oh, don't cut my throat, sir. Pray, don't do it, sir.
Tell us your name. Quick.
Pip, sir.
Once more. Give it mouth.
Pip, sir.
Show us where you live. No, put out the place.
I pointed to where our village lay, on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, looking after me, at the moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling while he ate the bread ravenously.
You young dog. What fat cheeks you got.
I believe they were fat, though I was at the time undersized for my years and not strong.
Darn me if I couldn't eat them. And if I didn't half of the mind to it.
I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to stop myself from crying.
Now, looky here. Where's your mother?
There, sir.
He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder.
There, sir. Also, Georgiana. That's my mother.
Oh. Is that your father along your mother?
Yes, sir. Him too late of his parish.
Who do you live with? Supposing you're kindly let to live, which I hadn't made up my mind about.
My sister, sir. Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir.
Blacksmith?
Said he, and looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his.
Now, look at here. The question being whether you're to be allowed to live. Do you know what a file is?
Yes, sir.
And you know what whittles is?
Yes, sir.
After each question, he tilted me over a little more, so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger.
Now, you get me a file, and you get me whittles.
He tilted me again.
You bring them both to me.
He tilted me again.
Or out of your heart and liver out.
He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said,
If you were kindly pleased to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more.
He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll, so that the church jumped over its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone and went on in these fearful terms.
You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over there. You do it, and you don't never dare say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever. And you shall be let to live. You fail, or you get, for my words, tell any person whatever, no matter how small it is, then your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate.
So I'm trusting not just to Dickens, but to Kit, my secret weapon, for... The two are entangled, of course, because, as I remember from Mr. Reggiani reading David Copperfield, what Dickens does is childhood like nobody else. But I hope you could hear the streakiness of the bacon there. That incredible opening scene from Great Expectations is a real place, isn't it? On the Kent marshes. You can go there, actually. You can see the graves. But it's also a weird place from a fairy story. It's a frightening episode, and it's also a comical episode. It's those combinations which are so extraordinary, so true to the fantastic part of all our lives. Also, you hear, I think, in that reading, especially in Tim's wonderful impersonation of Magwitch, what Dickens contributed to all our imaginations and our ears, his idiolects as the academics pompously call it. The voices of all his characters, each one different, each one distinctive of themselves. In the next passage, however, because we're going to have quite a lot of dialogue, I wanted a little snatch of something different, but in a way just as important, which is an example I sort of snatched at of why the adjective Dickensian has become so easy a part of our language. Dickensian is a word for all sorts of things, one of them being an all-embracing adjective for the kind of force of his imagination that takes a place, in this case it's going to be London, and both describes it and transforms it. So now, as a little example of that, Tom is going to read from a section of the opening of Bleak House.
Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among greenates and meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tears of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes. Fog on the Kentish heights. Fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs. Fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships. Fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats. Fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards. Fog in the stem and bowl of the pipe of the wrathful skipper, down in his close cabin. Fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck. Chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them, as if they were up in a balloon or hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may, from the spongy fields, be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look.
Yeah, I mean, the more Dickens, less of me, the better chance I have, evidently. I mean, you can hear perhaps, it goes on for pages, it's all as wonderful as that. And you can hear perhaps what is, if you're a literary critic, so wonderful about Dickens. He breaks every rule for how you're supposed to write. He repeats himself, he personifies gloriously and illogically. He loves the fantastic, those people seeming to float in a balloon in the fog. And a little earlier in the opening from the passage that Tom read, he allows him, he's describing how awful it is in November in London, and he says, there's as much mud, he says, in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. It's the first dinosaur in English fiction, trivial fact. And it's wonderful. It's monstrous, appalling, and utterly comical with its central London waddle. Dickens's fiction is full of delicious grotesquerie and monsters. But his monsters are such that he lets the reader see how they've been formed. And this next passage that Zawe and Julia are going to read is an example of that. It's from Great Expectations. Pip, who's aged 23 now, moons hopelessly after Estella, the hard-hearted Estella, who's been reared by Miss Havisham to be hard-hearted. And one day, Estella and Pip are summoned from London by Miss Havisham to visit them. And they go back to Satis house, and Pip overhears the following dialogue between Estella and Miss Havisham.
At least I was no party to the compact. For if I could walk and speak when it was made, it was as much as I could do. But what would you have? You have been very good to me, and I owe everything to you. What would you have?
Love.
You have it.
I have not.
Mother by adoption.
Retorted Estella, never departing from the easy grace of her attitude, never raising her voice as the other did, never yielding either to anger or to bitterness.
Mother by adoption. I have said that I owe everything to you. All I possess is freely yours. All that you have given me is at your command to have again. Beyond that, I have nothing. And if you ask me to give you what you never gave me, my gratitude and duty cannot do impossibilities.
Did I never give her love?
Cried Miss Havisham, turning wildly to me.
Did I never give her a burning love inseparable from jealousy at all times and from sharp pain while she speaks to me thus? Let her call me mad! Let her call me mad!
Why should I call you mad? I, of all people, does anyone live who knows what set purposes you have half as well as I do? Does anyone live who knows what a steady memory you have half as well as I do? I, who have sat on this same hearth on the little stool that is even now beside you there, learning your lessons and looking up into your face when your face was strange and frightening me.
Soon forgotten. Times soon forgotten.
No, not forgotten. Not forgotten. No, but treasured up in my memory. When have you found me false to your teaching? When have you found me unmindful of your lessons? When have you found me giving admission? Here.
She touched her bosom with her hand.
To anything that you excluded. Be just to me.
We were so proud. So proud.
Moaned Miss Havisham, pushing her away, pushing her grey hair with both her hands.
Who taught me to be proud? Who praised me when I learnt my lesson?
You're so hard. So hard.
Moaned Miss Havisham with her former action.
Who taught me to be hard? Who praised me when I learnt my lesson?
But to be proud and hard to me.
Miss Havisham quite shrieked as she stretched out her arms.
Stella, to be proud and hard to me.
Stella looked at her for a moment, and with a kind of calm wonder, but was not otherwise disturbed, when the moment was past, she looked down at the fire again.
I cannot think.
Said Estella, raising her eyes after a silence.
Why you should be so unreasonable when I come to see you after a separation. I have never forgotten your wrongs and their causes. I have never been unfaithful to you or your schooling. I have never shown any weakness that I can charge myself with.
Would it be weakness to return my love? But yes, she will call it so.
I begin to think,
Said Estella in a musing way after another moment of calm wonder.
that I almost understand how this comes about. If you had brought up your adopted daughter wholly in the dark confinement of these rooms and had never let her know that there was such a thing as the daylight by which she had never once seen your face, if you had done that and then for a purpose had wanted her to understand the daylight and know all about it, you would have been disappointed and angry.
Miss Havisham, with her head in her hands, sat making a low moaning and swaying herself on her chair, but gave no answer.
Or, which is a nearer case, if you had taught her from the dawn of her intelligence, with your utmost energy and might, that there was such a thing as daylight, but that it was made to be her enemy and destroyer, and she must always turn against it, for it had blighted you and would else blight her. If you had done this, and then for a purpose, had wanted her to take naturally to the daylight, and she could not, you would have been disappointed and angry.
Miss Havisham sat listening for a moment, for it seemed, for I could not see her face, but still made no answer.
So, I must be taken as I have been made. The success is not mine. The failure is not mine. but the two together make me.
I mean, Miss Havisham's a monster, but you kind of feel sorry for her, don't you? That's his trick, or one of his many tricks, to show you how people are made and twisted. And Pip, all the time, is listening to this, and he, too, has been made by his expectations into a different kind of monster. He's wonderful at populating our imaginations with these characters, populating our language with these characters. I mean, just think that there are more characters in Dickens who've become words in the Oxford English Dictionary than those of any other novelist. Gradgrind, bumble, heap, pecksniffium, they become adjectives. Pobslappery, nouns. Micawber-ish, best of all maybe, Scrooge. I mean, it's impossible to kind of face the fact that he invented that. It seems snatched out of nature itself. In the last reading, I want to come back to that strange mixture of the dark and the comical, the grim and the funny, that is so distinctive of Dickens, and is the thing he shares, I think, with Shakespeare, the jesting in the graveyard. Samuel Johnson said about Shakespeare, the mourner, in Shakespeare's The Mourner tramps to the funeral, the reveller staggers from the inn. And that's how it is in Dickens, where funerals are almost inevitably, inadvertently funny. In this last passage, which is from David Copperfield, we are Shay Micawber. David, and you've got to, the most important thing to remember for this passage is David Copperfield is 12 years old in this passage. His mother has died, and the ghastly Murdstones have sent him to work in the blacking factory. His one solace is that he has lodgings with the Micawbers, but then Mr. Micawber is arrested, as he inevitably always is, for debt and sent to the debtor's prison. In this passage, he's just been released, so there's a little bit of celebration, and the company, David, Mr. Micawber, Mrs. Micawber, numerous children, and the Orphaling. The Orphaling, by the way, is an orphan from the workhouse who is so down on her luck that she's the Micawber's servant. And this is what happens.
I passed my evenings with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber during the remaining term of our residence under the same roof. And I think we became fonder of one another as time went on. On the last Sunday, they invited me to dinner, and we had a loin of pork and applesauce and a pudding. I had bought a spotted wooden horse overnight as a parting gift to little Wilkins Micawber, that was the boy, and a doll for little Emma. I had also bestowed a shilling on the Orphaling, who was about to be disbanded. We had a very pleasant day, though we were all in a tender state about our approaching separation.
I shall never, Master Copperfield, revert to the period when Mr. Micawber was in difficulties without thinking of you. Your conduct has always been of the most delicate and obliging description. You have never been a lodger. You have been a friend.
My dear, Copperfield,
For so he had been accustomed to call me of late.
has a heart to feel for the distresses of his fellow creatures when they are behind a cloud, and a head to plan, and a hand to, in short, a general ability to dispose of such available property as he could be made away with.
I expressed my sense of this commendation and said I was very sorry we were going to lose one another.
My dear young friend, I am older than you, a man of some experience in life, and of some experience, in short, in difficulties, generally speaking. At present, and until something turns up, which I am, I may say, hotly expecting, I have nothing to bestow but advice. Still, my advice is so far worth taking that, in short, I have never taken it myself and am the...
Here, Mr. Micawber, who had been beaming and smiling all over his head and face up to the present moment, checked himself and frowned.
The miserable wretch that you behold.
My dear Micawber.
I say,
Returned Mr. Micawber, quite forgetting himself and smiling again.
the miserable wretch you behold. My advice is never do tomorrow what you can do today. Procrastination is the thief of time. Collar him.
My poor papa's maxim.
My dear, your papa was very well in his way, and heaven forbid that I should disparage him. Take him for all in all. We ne'er shall, in short, make the acquaintance, probably, of anybody else possessing at his time of life the same legs for gaiters and able to read the same description of print without spectacles. But he applied that maxim to our marriage, my dear, and that was so far prematurely entered into in consequence that I never recovered the expense.
Mr. Micawber looked aside at Mrs. Micawber and added,
Not that I am sorry for it, quite the contrary, my love.
after which he was grave for a minute or so.
My other piece of advice, Copperfield, you know. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 19 and 6, result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 ought and 6, result, misery. The blossom is blighted, the leaf is withered, the god of day goes down upon the dreary scene, and in short, you are forever flawed, as I am.
To make his example the more impressive, Mr. Micawber drank a glass of punch with an air of great enjoyment and satisfaction and whistled the college hornpipe. I did not fail to assure him that I would store these precepts in my mind, though indeed I had no need to do so, for at the time they affected me visibly.
Our time is sadly almost up, but perhaps you could hear in that wonderful passage that mixture of melancholy and buoyancy, that enjoyment and relish when you're supposed to be serious or grim, that is so distinctive of Dickens. Disaster and hilarity together. And actually, I think for Dickens, as for Mr. Micawber, what's so wonderful about him, that language, his language is his consolation as it was Dickens's.
Time's up.
Okay, I've got a really good final line, which I'm going to save for later.
All right, right.
Thank you very much.
That was John Mullan. Ladies and gentlemen, that was John Mullan and the Company for Charles Dickens. Now, Simon Schama for Leo Tolstoy.
How many of you read Tolstoy? Put up your hands. Not bad, but not a majority. I tell you why I'm asking you, dear friends. And that's because I know that Tolstoy, in some sense, would have hated the idea of who's winning and who's not. For Tolstoy, really, in a war, for example, nobody wins. In life, somehow everybody wins. And John is right that Tolstoy didn't really like Dickens. He worshipped Dickens. He actually heard Dickens in 1861 when he was in London. He heard Dickens read A Christmas Carol in one of his performances at St. James's Hall in Piccadilly. And we don't know really quite what he had thought of Christmas Carol, but the thought struck me that actually Tolstoy's joke book is quite thin, And you can bet your life there's not much in Tolstoy that would have made it to a panto, I think, in the way that Christmas Carol did. But I think there was something, what I want to try and do rather than win, I actually don't give a toss who wins because I love them both. What I do care about, and what I feel that Count Leo would care about, would try and persuade all those of you who've never gone near Tolstoy, so big, so forbidding, so daunting, that he actually, being inside Tolstoy's books, is not so much reading as actually having a life with it. The best thing that was ever said about Tolstoy, I think, was by the Russian writer Isaac Babel, who said, if the world could write itself, it would write like Tolstoy. Now, why is that? Tolstoy, who actually made one go at writing like Dickens, in particular David Copperfield, wrote it as his book called A Childhood. And Dickens was translated very, very quickly into Russian. And it's one of the most mawkish and awkward and forced and sentimental and disingenuous of all the things that Tolstoy did. So what Tolstoy did was go to a different place. And the different place that he went to was into the modern world. He's as much part of our experience, more so perhaps than he was of the 19th century. And what he did not want to do eventually was be theatrical like Dickens. He doesn't actually have characters in his book. He has people. He couldn't imagine having the Veneerings and the Pecksniffs and the Micawbers and the Magwitches. They are ordinary names of ordinary people. Dickens, of course, wrote to perform. He wrote for you. He wrote for an audience. Tolstoy only read out loud once in his life to a small group of family and friends in 1864, was very shy. We know he then did a lot of different parts. But what he wanted to do really was throw open a window. You could simply climb through that window and be in that world. So that sometimes the writing compared to Dickens is great, extravagant, look at me, applaud me. Theatricality is flat and limpid and sometimes even chilly. And there's another reason for that too. Tolstoy went to places Dickens didn't go, namely to the war. He went beyond Europe. He went on a raid to a village with his brother Nikolai to Chechnya. He served in the Crimean War. He saw the full horror of war. And I think for Tolstoy at that moment, actually, any kind of flamboyance disgusted him. At the very end of his writing life, he came back to the experience. He spoke many, many languages, including some Caucasian languages like Turkmen. He came back to that experience in an astonishing story. Some of the greatest things that Tolstoy ever did are short stories. And this one is called Haji Murat. It's a long, short story. He came to it and went back from it many times between 1896 and 1904. This is from chapter 17, the shortest in Haji Murat. And it's an account of what happens to a village in the Caucasus, a Chechen village, when the Russian army raid has got through it. Two words which otherwise will sound very weird. An aul is a Chechen village, and a saklia is a house. And Haji Murat is a Chechen chieftain who had been part of the resistance to the Russians, went over, now decided he'd go over to the Russians because he hated the local imam. And the story begins with Haji Murat being received in this particular village. But after the Russians had got through with it, this is what happens.
The aul devastated by the raid was the one in which Haji Murat had spent the night before his coming over to the Russians. Sado, with whom Haji Murat had stayed, was leaving for the mountains with his family when the Russians approached the aul. When he came back to his aul, he found his saklia destroyed. The roof had fallen in. The doors and posts of the little gallery were burned down, and the inside was befouled. His son, the handsome boy with shining eyes who'd looked rapturously at Haji Murat, was brought dead to the mosque on a horse covered by a burqa. He'd been stabbed in the back with a bayonet. The fine-looking woman who'd waited on Haji Murat during his visit, now in a smock torn in front, revealing her old sagging breasts with her hair undone, stood over her son and clawed her face until it bled and wailed without ceasing. Sado took a pick and shovel and went with some relations to dig a grave for his son. The old grandfather sat by the wall of the destroyed Saclia and, whittling a little stick, stared dully before him. He'd just come back from his apiary. The 2 haystacks, formerly there, had been burned. The apricot and cherry trees he had planted and nursed were broken and scorched. And worst of all, the beehives had all been burned. The wailing of women could be heard in all the houses and on the square where 2 more bodies had been brought. The small children wailed along with their mothers. Hungry cattle who had nothing to eat also bellowed. The older children did not play, but looked at their elders with frightened eyes. The spring had been befouled, obviously on purpose, so that it was impossible to take water from it. The mosque was also befouled, and the mullah and his assistants were cleaning it up. The old heads of households gathered on the square and, squatting down, discussed their situation. Of hatred for the Russians, no one even spoke. The feeling that was experienced by all the Chechens, big and small, was stronger than hatred. It was not hatred, but a refusal to recognize these Russian dogs as human beings, and such loathing, disgust, and bewilderment before the absurd cruelty of these beings that the wish to exterminate them, like the wish to exterminate rats, venomous spiders, and wolves, was as natural as the sense of self-preservation.
Like Dickens, Tolstoy was very interested in geography, in specifics of place, and indeed in nature. Nature is a real actor. I think one of the things, like John, I don't at all want to be oppositional on this, but one of the things I think that Tolstoy does, because he lives so much in the country, he lives with the seasons so very much on his estate, that he's wonderful about animals. And actually, possibly, you could make an argument, I won't make it here, that the very greatest thing he ever wrote was a short story called Master and Man, the cast of which are 2 peasants, one is a peasant merchant, and a horse, a bay gelding Muhorti, who head off into a snowstorm. And it would be a spoiler to tell you with what consequences that is. But nature is an actor. Nature is ferocious. Nature is extraordinary, especially the Russian winter, of course. And there is a great fog passage, ain't there? In War and Peace. We're now going to have a fog off, actually. You know the Russian family, the Fogoffs. You know. They wouldn't let anyone look at them. They were completely stumbling around. But the fog for Tolstoy is a fog which actually hangs over the battlefield at Austerlitz. And it's not the thing that John very cunningly and wisely, I too love absolutely that opening of the Bleak House. My dad performed it magnificently. My dad should have met Mr. Reggiani, I think. But it goes on, and fogs and fogs and fogs. And the fog eventually is a kind of piece of dramatic filmic play. It settles around the head of the Lord Chief Justice. But Tolstoy has a real fog, and it's the fog that is concealing. It's in the morning of the fog before the battle, the fog lifts from the height of the hill, but the fog just stays in a foggy bottom, and with tremendous, tremendous kind of consequences. And it's another kind of real fog. The fog was so thick that though day was breaking, one couldn't see 10 paces ahead. Bushes looked like enormous trees, level places like cliffs and slopes. Everywhere on all sides one might run into an enemy, invisible, few paces away. In the bottom, where the action began, the fog was still thick, but up above it had cleared, but nothing of what was happening could be seen from above, down below. Danger for the Russian army. 9 o'clock in the morning, an unbroken sea of fog spread below. But at the village of Schlapanitz on the heights, Where Napoleon stood surrounded by marshals, it was perfectly light. Over him was the clear blue sky, and the enormous ball of the sun, like a huge, hollow, crimson float, bobbed on the surface of the milky sea of fog. Fantastic stuff. And very often, actually, the great force of you being there is built up from these sharply, perfectly described physical moments. Often the greatness of Tolstoy's work is built up from these little tiles of tiny details as well. He is at the same time cosmic and imperious and Olympian and panoramic and minute things. My favorite little tile, a sort of tessera really, is when the Battle of Borodino, incredibly bloody battle that happened, and among its casualties are Prince Andrei and Anatole, two antagonists. And a field surgeon emerges from the tent of a field hospital. Tolstoy describes him holding a cigar, and I can't do it, my old arthritic chronic hands, between the thumb and the little finger. Why? Because the middle fingers are covered in blood, and he doesn't want to light the cigar while blood is all over it. Reality, a hard, vivid, brutal thing. The other thing to introduce the next reading is that, well, I think actually Tolstoy has a grip on a particular reality of the lives of women. We heard this wonderful exchange between Miss Havisham and Estella, but so many of Dickens's women are either monsters or angels, two monsters. One has brought up the other monster in Great Expectations. Tolstoy, it seemed to me, actually, and they both treated women badly, although Tolstoy loved his wife, Sophia, throughout his life, or however stormy it was. Tolstoy knew how women relate to each other. And one passage we want now to give you is actually two sisters. This is the so-called subplot, but it's terribly important, from Anna Karenina. The Sherbatsky sisters, Kitty, the younger one, Dolly, the older one, they both suffered. The whole famous opening of Anna Karenina is Dolly Sherbatsky has been betrayed by her adulterous husband. So she somehow wants to keep the marriage together, but she's distraught and worn down by what she has to go through. Kitty, the young one, has turned down the man who really loves her, a man called Levin, who is Tolstoy in disguise, because she's actually in love with Vronsky, the clothes source for whom Anna Karenina falls. They come together as sisters, but they come together in a kind of tortured passion.
Entering Kitty's small boudoir, a pretty little pink room with dolls as young, pink and gay as Kitty had been just 2 months earlier, Dolly remembered with what gaiety and love they had decorated this little room together last year. Her heart went cold when she saw Kitty, sitting on the low chair nearest the door, staring fixedly at a corner of the rug. Kitty glanced at her sister, and her cold, somewhat severe expression did not change. I'll leave now and stay put at home, and you won't be allowed to visit me. I would like to talk to you.
About what?
Well, what else if not your grief?
I have no grief.
Come now, Kitty. Can you really think I don't know? I know everything. And believe me, it's nothing. We've all gone through it. Kitty was silent, and her face had a stern expression. He's not worth your suffering over him.
Yes, because he scorned me.
Kitty said in a quavering voice.
Don't talk about it, please don't.
Why? Who told you that? No one said that. I am sure He was in love with you and is still in love, but...
Oh, these condolences are the most terrible thing of all for me.
Kitty cried out suddenly, getting angry. She turned on her chair, blushed, and quickly moved her fingers, clutching the belt buckle she was holding, now with one hand, now with the other. Dolly knew this way her sister had of grasping something with her hands when she was in a temper. She knew that Kitty was capable of forgetting herself in such a moment and saying a lot of unnecessary and unpleasant things. And Dolly wanted to calm her down, but it was already too late.
What? What is it you want to make me feel? What?
Kitty was talking quickly.
That I was in love with a man who cared nothing for me, and that I'm dying of love for him? And I'm told this by my sister, who thinks that she's commiserating? I don't want these pityings and pretenses.
Kitty, you are unfair.
Why do you torment me?
On the contrary, I see that you are upset. But in her temper, Kitty did not hear.
I have nothing to be distressed or comforted about. I'm proud enough never to allow myself to love a man who does not love me.
But I'm not saying... One thing. Tell me the truth. Tell me, did Levin speak to you? The mention of Levin seemed to take away the last of Kitty's self-possession. She jumped up from the chair, flinging the buckle to the floor, and with quick gestures of her hand began to speak.
Why bring Levin into it too? I don't understand. Why do you need to torment me? I said, and I repeat, that I am proud and would never, never do what you're doing. Go back to a man who's betrayed you, who's fallen in love with another woman. I don't understand. I don't understand that. You may, but I can't.
And having said these words, she glanced at her sister, and seeing that Dolly kept silent, her head bowed sadly, Kitty, instead of leaving the room as she had intended, sat down by the door, and covering her face with a handkerchief, bowed her head. The silence lasted for some 2 minutes. Dolly was thinking about herself. Her humiliation, which she always felt, echoed especially painfully in her when her sister reminded her of it. She had not expected such cruelty from her sister and was angry with her. But suddenly she heard the rustling of a dress, along with the sound of suppressed sobs bursting out, and someone's arms encircled her neck from below. Kitty was kneeling before her.
Dolinka, I am so unhappy.
She whispered guiltily.
Beloveds go off into the sunset in Dickens. Agnes and David. Dora says, call me your wife, child. Tolstoy is the first of the great writers, I think. It looks forward to Strindberg and Ibsen, who actually understands love can make you obsessed. It can turn bad. It can be very unhappy. Flaubert does that. He's very, very close to that, I think. And Anna Karenina, one of the most extraordinary things in a passage we're going to read now, is actually the point at which the two lovers, Anna and Vronsky, who should be in the throes of infatuated joy, a cloud actually passes between them. Why? Because Anna has just told Vronsky, or tells Vronsky, that she has told her husband what's going on. And this is an extraordinary passage about how men and women, lovers both, respond in completely different ways. Vronsky, the magnificent military horse-riding clothes horse, only can think of himself fighting a duel. That's what he thinks of immediately. That is not what's on Anna's mind. Let's read this.
You're not angry that I sent for you. It was necessary for me to see you.
Serious and stern set of her lips, he could see behind the veil, immediately changed his state of mind.
I angry. But how did you come? Why here?
Never mind. Come, we must talk.
He understood something had happened, that this meeting was not going to be joyful. In her presence, he had no will of his own, not knowing the reason for her anxiety, but he already felt that this same anxiety involuntarily communicated itself to him.
What is it? What?
She walked a few steps in silence, gathering her courage, and suddenly stopped.
I didn't tell you yesterday that on the way home with Alexei Alexandrovich, I told him everything. I said that I could not be his wife, that I told him everything.
He listened to her, involuntarily leaning his whole body towards her as if wishing in this way to soften the difficulty of her situation. But as soon as she'd said it, she suddenly straightened up and his face acquired a proud and stern expression.
Yes, it's better, 1,000 times better. I understand how difficult it was.
But she wasn't listening to his words. She was reading his thoughts in the expression of his face. She couldn't have known that his expression reflected the first thought that occurred to him, that a duel was now inevitable. The thought of a duel had never entered her head, and therefore she explained this momentary expression of sternness differently. Having received her husband's letter, she already knew in the depths of her soul everything would remain as before, that she would be unable to scorn her position, to leave her son, unite herself with her lover. The morning spent at Princess Tverskoy's had confirmed her still more in that. But all the same, this meeting was extremely important to her. She hoped it would change their situation and save her. If at this news he should say to her resolutely, passionately, without a moment's hesitation,
abandon everything and fly away with me.
She would leave her son and go with him, but the news did not produce in him what she expected. He only seemed insulted by something.
It wasn't the least bit difficult. It got done by itself.
I understand.
He interrupted, taking the letter without reading it and trying to calm her.
I wished for one thing, I asked for one thing, to break up this situation in order to devote my life to your happiness.
Why are you telling me that? Could I possibly doubt it if I did?
Who's that coming?
Vronsky says suddenly, pointing at two ladies coming towards them.
Maybe they know us.
He hastened to turn down a sidewalk, drawing her after him.
But I don't care. As I said, that is not the point. I cannot doubt that, but there is what he writes. Here is what he writes to me. Read it.
Again, as in the first moment of the news of her break with her husband, Vronsky, while reading the letter, involuntarily yielded to the natural impression aroused in him by his attitude towards the insulted husband. Now, as he held the letter in his hands, he involuntarily pictured to himself the challenge he'd probably find today or tomorrow, the duel itself, during which he'd stand with the same cold and proud expression now on his face, having fired into the air, awaiting the insulted husband's shot. And at once there flashed into his head what he himself had thought that morning, that it was better not to bind himself. And he knew he couldn't tell her this thought. Having read the letter, he raised his eyes to her, and there was no firmness in his look. She understood at once that he already thought it over to himself. She knew that whatever he might tell her, he would not say everything he thought. And she understood her last hope had been disappointed. This was not what she'd expected. One of the most... We go straight on to the next thing, because another great thing, the extraordinary thing about why I think Tolstoy felt that he sort of had mixed feelings, didn't like theatricality so much, because the great drama in all Tolstoy's writing, the greatest drama, are interior monologues. He invents stream of consciousness writing. I'm sure James Joyce actually took a lot. Often the speech is broken, and there are these gaps. What is actually said is often portrayed by body language rather than actually the words themselves. And one of the greatest passages, A Stream of Consciousness, so fierce, and it's taken directly from Tolstoy's life, is when Levin, the second hero, really the hero of the male hero of the book, and this, again, is out of time. It speaks to us all. How many parents in here? You're all parents, except for Kit, who is going to be one, as well as the star. This is what happens when Levin is waiting for the birth of his child, his wife, Kitty.
He did not know whether it was late or early. The candles were all burning low. Dolly had just come to the study to suggest that the doctor lie down. Levin sat there listening to the doctor tell about a quack, mesmerist, and watching the ashes of his cigarette. It was a period of rest, and he'd become oblivious. He'd entirely forgotten what was going on now. He listened to the doctor's story and understood it. Suddenly, there was a scream unlike anything he had ever heard. The scream was so terrible that Levin didn't even jump up, but, holding his breath, gave the doctor a frightened, questioning look. The doctor cocked his head to one side, listening, and smiled approvingly. It was all so extraordinary that nothing any longer astonished Levin. Probably it should be so, he thought, and went on sitting. Whose scream was it? He jumped up, ran tiptoe to the bedroom, went round Lizaveta Petrovna and the princess, and stood in his place at the head of the bed. The screaming had ceased. But something was changed now. What, he did not see or understand, nor did he want to see and understand. But he saw it from Lizaveta Petrovna's face. Her face was stern and pale and still just as resolute, though her jaws twitched a little and her eyes were fixed on Kitty. Kitty's burning, tormented face with a strand of hair stuck to her sweaty forehead was turned to him and sought his eyes. Her raised hands asked for his. Seizing his hands in her sweaty hands, she started pressing them to her face.
Don't leave, don't leave. I'm afraid, I'm afraid.
She spoke quickly.
Mama, take my earrings, they bother me. You're not afraid? Oh, God, soon. Lizaveta Petrovna, soon.
She spoke quickly, and tried to smile. But suddenly her face became distorted and she pushed him away from her.
No, it's terrible. I'll die. Go, go.
She cried, and again came that scream that was unlike anything in the world. Levin clutched his head and ran out of the room. He knew that all was now lost. Leaning his head against the doorpost, he stood in the next room and heard a shrieking and howling such as he had never heard before. And he knew that these cries were coming from what once had been Kitty. He had long ceased wishing for the child. He now hated this child. He did not even wish for her to live now. He only wished for an end to this terrible suffering. Doctor, what is it? What is it, my God? He said, seizing the doctor by the arm as he came in.
It's nearly over.
And the doctor's face was so serious as he said it that Levin understood this nearly over to mean she was dying. Forgetting himself, he ran into the bedroom. The first thing he saw was Lizaveta Petrovna's face. It was still more stern and frowning. Kitty's face was not there. In place of it, where it used to be, was something dreadful, both in its strange look and in the sound that came from it. He leant his head against the wooden bedstead, feeling his heart was bursting. The terrible screaming would not stop. It became still more terrible, and then, as if reaching the final limit of the terrible, it suddenly stopped. Levin did not believe his ears, but there could be no doubt. The screaming stopped, and there was a quiet stirring, a rustle and quick breathing, and her faltering, alive, gentle, and happy voice softly said,
It's over.
He raised his head, her arms resting strengthlessly on the blanket, remarkably beautiful and quiet. She silently looked at him and tried, but was unable to smile.
You ain't heard nothing yet. It nearly is over, but the last section we're going to give you is actually my favorite in all of Tolstoy's writing. It comes from great climactic moment in War and Peace. And Tolstoy really is, as a lot of people have noticed, two writers. He's the writer of power, of the public world, of the absurdity of history. But he's also the writer of you, as you've been listening to, of the intensity and complicated truth of the passions between men and women, and between brothers and friends and sisters and children and parents. And all these things come together at a particular moment. The moment is this. Natasha, the extraordinary, exuberant girl at the heart of War and Peace, who's based actually on Tolstoy's own wife's younger sister, Tanya, has been engaged, been married to the cold, brilliant Prince Andrei, who, like an idiot, has said we have to wait for a year to see if it really is going to be good. And during the year, which is unbearable for someone of Natasha's warm blood, she almost elopes. She falls in love with someone who's already married, as we discovered, Anatol Karagin, a beautiful no-goodnik, a technical Russian term. And she's discovered and she's disgraced. And what happens to this life force of War and Peace is that she becomes ill, she hates everybody, she hates her family, she who would love them all, she hates herself, she's close to dying of all this terrible feeling, and then eventually somehow this spectral wraith of a girl comes back to life, and looking on all the time is Pierre Bezukhov, another version of Tolstoy. Pierre, who'd wanted Andrei and Natasha to be married, but who finds himself caught between them. He wants to be a friend to Natasha, but something inside his heart and his body and his head also wants to be something more. Most of all, he wants to somehow, he knows he can't bring Natasha and Pierre back together, but most of all, what? No, you can't. Of course not. You Tolstoy, no, this, let's just do it. Let's just do this thing.
Natasha, wasted, with a pale and stern face, not at all shamefaced as Pierre expected her to be, was standing in the middle of the drawing room. When Pierre appeared at the doorway, she became flustered, obviously undecided whether to go to him or wait for him. Pierre hastily went up to her. He thought that she would give him her hand, as always, but coming close to him, she stopped, breathing heavily and lowering her arms lifelessly, in exactly the same pose in which she came out to the middle of the room to sing, but with quite a different expression.
Pyotr Kirillich, Prince Bolkonsky was your friend. Is your friend.
She corrected herself. It seemed to her that everything only was, and that now it was all different.
He told me then to turn to you.
Pierre sniffed silently, looking up at her. Up to then, he had reproached her in his soul and had tried to despise her. But now he felt such pity for her that there was no room in his soul for reproach.
He's here now. Tell him to, forgive me.
She stopped and began to breathe still more rapidly, but she did not cry.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I'll tell him, but he did not know what to say. Natasha was evidently afraid of the thought that might have occurred to Pierre.
No, I know it's all over. No, it can never be. I'm only tormented by the wrong I've done him. Tell him only that I beg him to forgive me for everything.
Her whole body shook and she sat down on a chair. A feeling of pity such as he had never experienced before overflowed Pierre's soul. I'll tell him everything once more. But I'd like to know one thing.
What?
I'd like to know whether you loved. Pierre did not know what to call Anatole, and he blushed at the thought of him. Whether you loved that bad man.
Don't call him bad. But I don't know. I don't know anything.
She began to cry again. A still greater feeling of pity, tenderness, and love took hold of Pierre. He felt tears flowing behind his spectacles and hoped they would not be noticed. Let's not talk anymore, my friend. It seemed so strange suddenly for Natasha to hear that meek, tender, heartfelt voice. Let's not talk, my friend. I'll tell him everything. But one thing I ask you, consider me your friend. And if you need help, advice, or simply to pour out your soul to somebody, not now, but when your soul is clear, remember me. I'll be happy to if I'm able.
Don't talk to me like that. I'm not worthy of it.
She was about to leave the room, but Pierre held her back by the hand. He knew he had something more to tell her, but when he said it, he was surprised at his words himself.
Stop it, stop it! You have your whole life ahead of you.
Ahead of me? No. For me, all is lost.
All is lost. If I were not I, but the handsomest, brightest, and best man in the world, and I was free, I would go on my knees this minute and ask for your hand and your love. Natasha, for the first time in many days, wept tears of gratitude and tenderness, and after glancing at Pierre, left the room. Pierre, too, following her, almost ran out to the front hall, holding back the tears of tenderness and happiness that choked him, put on his coat and, missing the sleeves, got into the sleigh.
Where to now, sir? Asked the coachman.
Where to? Pierre asked himself. Where can I go now? Not to the club or to pay visits. All people seemed so pitiful, so poor in comparison with the feeling of tenderness and love he experienced, in comparison with that softened, grateful glance she'd given him at the last moment through her tears.
Home, said Pierre, throwing open the bearskin coat on his broad, joyfully breathing chest despite the 10 degrees of frost.
It was cold and clear. Above the city's semi-dark streets, above the black roofs, stood the stark, starry sky. Only looking at the sky did Pierre not feel the insulting baseness of everything earthly compared with the height his soul had risen to. At the entrance to Arbat Square, the huge expanse of the dark, starry night opened out to Pierre's eyes. Almost in the middle of that sky, over Prechestensky Boulevard, stood the huge, bright comet of the year 1812. Surrounded, strewn with stars on all skies, but different from them in its closeness to the earth, its white light and long raised tail. The same comet which presaged, as they said, all sorts of horrors and the end of the world. But for Pierre, this bright star with its long, luminous tail did not arouse any frightening feeling. On the contrary, Pierre, his eyes wet with tears, gazed joyfully at this bright star, which, having flown with inexpressible speed through immeasurable space on its parabolic course, suddenly, like an arrow piercing the earth, seemed to have struck here, its one chosen spot in the black sky, and stopped. Its tail raised energetically, its white light shining and playing among the countless other shimmering stars. It seemed to Pierre that this star answered fully to what was, in his softened and encouraged soul, now blossoming into new life.
Okay. Simon Schama and Company. Simon Schama and Company for Leo Tolstoy. I'd like to ask the company a question. And this is, I guess, a playwright's question to you. Anybody can answer. How do you as actors prepare to come into prose as opposed to text, to play text? Because they're different machines. So as actors, I'm talking about building, working, do you enter it differently? or is it the same? Anybody?
I think even if you're on your own, you have to say it out loud. That's what I experienced with this, because reading both Dickens and Tolstoy in your head was very different to how it came out, and the feeling of it moving through you when you said it out loud. So saying it out loud as much as possible to get a proper handle on the difference as it moves through you, as opposed to it working in your head, was really interesting. I really actually enjoyed that.
Particularly when you're playing a character, obviously. Can I just ask a question? Because I'm ignorant about how Tolstoy wrote. Dickens wrote in serial form, had to, because...
Yes.
Tolstoy not, I think.
No, Tolstoy, I mean, it was very extraordinary. Anna Karenina, he started in 1873, and it took him, I think it was 7 years to write War and Peace, 5,000 pages of drafts, odes to his wife. So he was very, very slow and painstaking. And Anna Karenina, he thought in 1873 he'd got it nailed, and he didn't. It took him another 4 years. The first draft of Anna Karenina, actually, the husband, Anna Karenina's husband, is a kind of hero. And the more he thought about it, and Anna is a kind of scarlet woman, and he's just waiting for her to come to a sticky end. That absolutely changed in the relentless redrafting, so that she's fully imbued. So he was sort of I think he would have loved to have actually turned it all out like Dickens.
But this is all for you as actors, research. This is your research. This is what you do as you're going into a role, and I'm interested in the difference for you building physically, voice, because you're building as you're working with character. And a play text is much different. You come on stage and you have a script. That's a different thing. You have cues, you have lights, you have all of these things. And you guys, you all, have picked up a text and entered it. So I just wondered if there's anything you can share with the audience, especially young actors, young theater people going into it for the first time. How do you enter this?
The interesting thing about both Tolstoy and Dickens is the richness of description. With a play, you just have the dialogue, and so I'm trying to think of Pinter or Beckett, or you're basically looking for subtext, because underneath the meaning of the things people say are the things people mean. Sometimes they don't say what they mean. Whereas with Tolstoy and Dickens, you've got these long passages of where both writers invite the reader into the mind of the protagonist or of the character. So that Tolstoy piece with Levin waiting for Kitty to give birth, it's actually in the third person, but it's written with such a momentum that it feels like it's in the first person in some way.
Yes.
And so actually, that's true of all. If you're ever in a situation as an actor where there's a book, it's such a blessing, because you can go to the book and look at all this interiority to shore up the exterior, which is what we have to present as actors.
Okay, go.
Okay, because Simon, I don't know if you noticed, rather like the author of War and Peace.
Can I ask you something when you're doing this?
Yes.
I'd like you to tell us, because all of these novels are immortal. They live now. They don't live in the past. They live now. In Dickens, what women, and as part of your answer, what women for you live now? Now. Who speaks to us now?
Well, I think that I chose, I suppose, that exchange between Estella and Miss Havisham, because in its weird and twisted way, it seems to me as vivid as it would have seemed to its first readers. And, Miss Havisham says, "Call me mad," and Estella says, "No, you're not mad." And it's true that, and I knew Simon would mention it, that Dickens does terrifying women and angelic women and that he's not top-notch on his sexual politics of his fiction. But I think, in general, actually, and this is my appeal to the audience, there's much less embarrassing or excessive or in poor taste in Tolstoy. Tolstoy was a count. You heard Simon describing his writing method, come on and on and on and on. Dickens wrote compendiously and extravagantly within this sort of tiny, this incredible discipline of the periodical form. And I think that he gave us characters, if you like, out of fantasy, including women like Estella and Miss Havisham. But I suppose what I'm saying is fantasy is truer than reality in a way, or the fantastic can be truer than the realistic. If you want the realistic, you want Tolstoy, you want George Eliot, but it's because Dickens has a handle on the fantastic, including in his depiction of characters like Estella and Miss Havisham, that his words live on in our thoughts and in our sayings, and I sort of think in our dreams, really.
So would you say he, in a sense, invented a kind of our secular life in some ways?
I think he gave us, like all great novelists, and I think comparisons are odorous, you know. I mean, I think more than Tolstoy in this sense. He gave us characters that, I mean, I have a weird domestic life, and I'm sorry, my wife and I say things like, oh, a bit of a Uriah, pushing that way. I mean, he gave us a kind of psychological vocabulary, and that's not the same. He didn't give us anybody as psychologically complex as Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch. He gave us sort of strange, distorted examples of the way we all are sometimes. And that's a different kind of thing, and that seems to be something that actually kind of survives more vividly.
Thank you very much. This was different. I'm going to open this.
You promised me.
Okay, I'm going to give you. Simon, you got it, but you got a limited time. So give me a minute, and then do it.
Well, I think actually, John is absolutely right that Dickens is. I mean, it more than ever, it seems ludicrous that we should have this gladiatorial slam, but that's what we have. Absolutely right. Dickens gave us the kind of extravagant possibilities, the farther frontier of the human imagination, and we need that. And nobody did it other than Shakespeare exactly like him. Tolstoy, when I said Tolstoy loved Dickens and transcended it, what Tolstoy wanted to do in the greatest things he wrote, and he carried on writing great things, not in great fat novels, was to make us look, the reality of life sounds so bleak, so pedantic in a way. But Tolstoy actually could, because he had such sharp eyes and he could actually translate poetically what he saw into this exquisite language, that everything we do, going to sleep at night, playing with children, being terrified in war, has a kind of startling, enhanced crispness and freshness. Things that we think we do suddenly seem as though we'd never done them before. Very interestingly, he became, of course, an impossibly sententious moral teacher. There's one wonderful moment where he said, I'm very happy to entertain any problems that students might have. So 2 students came a long way from the Urals to see Tolstoy, and they say, the servant answers the door, Yasnaya Polyana, and they say, Lev Nikolaevich, has said we can ask him any questions. And the master said, I'm not sure if he's in. And he goes to Tolstoy and says, Tolstoy, these young men have come thousands of miles from New York. Tolstoy said, I'm not in. And then immediately he said that he runs to the door and said, young man, I've sinned, what's your question? And they said, well, Lev Nikolaevich, you say that it's wrong to resist evil with violence, but what if a tiger sprang at you from the jungle? And Tolstoy looked at them and said, young men, such things very seldom happen. So
Okay.
he could be impossible. No, last thing, I promise, very last thing. A moral teacher called Boborikin gave him his 2 novels to read, and Tolstoy said they're incredibly bad, and I'll tell you why they're bad. And this is what he says, and it sums up the Tolstoy case. The aim of an artist is not to solve a problem irrefutably, but to make people love life in all its manifestations. If I were told that I could write a novel whereby I might irrefutably establish the correct point of view on all social problems, I would not even devote 2 hours on such a novel. But if I were told that what I should write would be read in about 20 years' time by those who are now children, that they would laugh and cry over it and love life, I would devote all my own life and all my energies to it.
Thank you. Simon, that was gorgeous. That was gorgeous, but you know, we were on vaudeville, they would give you the hook at this point, right? But that was gorgeous. All right, here are the final tallies. Before these distinguished gentlemen spoke to us and their advocates, we were 44% for Dickens, 40% for Tolstoy, and 16% for DK's, the undecided. Now, after the debate, we are 42% for Dickens, 53% for Tolstoy, and 5% unknown. Now, before we go, I have to say my preference, because everybody, well, the actors didn't. The actors should do this as well. But yes, act of the company first. Go. I mean, you got to pick one.
Sorry,
Okay?
I didn't
The
hear.
company, which one? Who would you, who?
Oh, Dickens.
Okay.
Dickens!
Mr. West.
Yeah, Dickens, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Dickens, because my dad's favourite is also Dickens.
Both?
No, little brother, one of these.
Dickens.
Okay. See, I knew it was
Everybody
lingering.
else said that.
Mr. Hiddleston.
Tolstoy.
Now I'm going to throw my 2 cents in, and then we're going to get off the stage. If there is another life that we were all given to live, one of the things I like to live and do in it is read Russian, so I can read Tolstoy. So thank you all. I love Dickens, I love him, but Tolstoy. Let's have a round of applause for this magnificent company who've come out to perform for us. And for our 2 advocates, Simon Schama, who won, and John Mullan, who won. And a round of applause for Intelligence Squared, who presented this. And a round of applause to yourself, because I want to say, I don't know if the company felt this, but I just felt the intelligence, the attention, and the whole energy just coming this way. You made it so much easier for all of us. We were nervous. So thank you. Thank you.